Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for coming. I'm Robin Morris, convener of the Oxford Energy Network. Hello to people online as well. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce our speaker, Phil Grunewald. Just before that, for those of you who couldn't make Chris Llewellyn-Smith talk last week, the recording and slides are up and available. And also we've taken out all the bit where people are fiddling around trying to find where the slides work and so on. So it looks really slick now. So well done to everyone for that. So I've known Phil quite some time. My first interaction was looking at the carbon benefits from energy vectors, and he was down at Imperial College at the time. So it was this arbitrage between off-peak carbon, overnight carbon, and the fact that we were burning a lot of coal in those days. Of course, the system has changed quite considerably since then. I also brought a project to Phil where I was hoping he was going to get his hands on lots of customers' electricity consumption data and so on. In fact, it got picked up by some of the behavioural people in the same team, which was great. But only I could uncover the excitement in North Wales. There would be people making cups of tea on a Tuesday afternoon because it was raining. They'd be making more cups of tea. Or the gentleman who would come down at night to turn on his washing machine when the load in the community was at its lowest, just because his neighbours couldn't do it. But he didn't have an automated appliance, so he would literally get up in the middle of the night to do that. And people say flexibility isn't possible. Anyway, having said that, I mean, Phil started life here in the Environmental Change Institute, and you've taught on a number of MSc and MBA programs and so forth. I was pleased to be involved in Phil's fellowship, the METER program. I kept trying to get him to extend things like time and so on, but it was no 24 hours. And I think it was great to take a slice out of what people were doing. And I'm really pleased Phil's now moved across. And we first asked you to come and talk about EDOL in February. Hadn't started then, so that's good. And then tried again a bit later, that didn't work either. And now we've got you here today. There's no expectation that you've delivered lots of results yet, so don't worry about that. But we just really like to hear a lot more about the Energy Demand Observatory and Laboratory. So Phil, over to you.
Thank you very much, Robin. Yes, back in February, you would have literally just been an introduction to what we're about to do. I'm going to show you a few things that have already happened. But yeah, February, I think that was strike action and then one thing and another. So here we are. I'm delighted to be here and tell you about the new Energy Demand Observatory and Laboratory. But basically, I'm going to wrap it a little bit wider because last week, as Robin said, we had Chris Llewellyn-Smith, who gave us a fantastic talk about storage, large-scale storage. And in that, he mentioned demand, not a lot, but he did mention how they sort of made assumptions about demand and how they sort of settled for 570 terawatt hours. And he also made the point that, you know, it doesn't actually change the cost of storage all that much, whether that goes up or down. And I mean, fascinating topic. And I loved it especially because it was this very topic that over 10 years ago got me onto this whole understanding energy demand. And that was in part because of work, as Robin said, back at Imperial College with Goran Strobak and others, where we tried to assess the whole system value of storage. So we didn't so much look at the cost because nobody knew the cost back then, but we wanted to see what can the system save if you had storage in a future low carbon system. And as is the way with these models, you come up with some astronomically wonderfully large sums of money, like £5 billion a year possible saving. But back then my interest was, well, what if we push these models a little bit and try alternatives to storage? So if we built more interconnect, or say, if we were more flexible about our demand. So we tried that in the models, put more flexible demand in, and what happened is the value plummeted from £5 billion down by 4.5 billion. You know, it's a tenth of the value is left after you put in flexible demand. And my question back then was, where do these assumptions come from, how flexible demand can be, and what a future load profile looks like? And it was some general shoulder shrugging. And I thought, well, given that the difference is quite profound, and that we're still sort of, not even Chris Llewellyn-Smith at the moment is sort of, you know, stepping away and say, we need to make some simple assumption here. That sort of captivated me and has done for the last 10 years. I've been digging at this number. And obviously, I still need to work on this because Chris has not yet taken it into his model. So over the next 5 years, I hope we can get to a point where these data can sort of flow into future models, so we can say, okay, here are different scenarios for demand, and we can test them in solid storage models. So work in progress, but we're in an interesting and good place to review today. This is a slide I always show because I think it is sort of a nice "you are here" sort of graph. The Committee on Climate Change, keeps good track of how we're doing against our carbon commitments, and we're sort of halfway in time, halfway in reduction, but we're also at a sort of transition point from something to something completely different. Up until here, and you've seen the cover on Chris's report, was not storage, this was wind turbines. And that's sort of very much what carried us up to here. In fact, technical solution, shall we say, generation and some efficiency measures, but mostly of the kind where you don't have to do much fundamentally differently. You may still buy a light bulb, it just happens to be more efficient. That story is going to change fundamentally from here going forward. So the second half towards 2050, you and I and everyone will have to make changes to our lives that actually impact us in some way. And as we already sort of pick up from the political discourse, there's some unease how far you can push people and how much we can expect of people. So understanding how we take people down this curve, and as the King in his speech had to say today, without stressing people unduly, what we can duly expect of people, I think needs some detailed understanding. And the way the Climate Change Committee broke it down, over half of the measures from here to 2050 are either social and technical or entirely social in nature. So for the type of work that I've been doing over the last 10 years, that bodes well that there's more going in this direction. Now, to give you a bit of background, so Robin mentioned my meter study and how I sort of restricted electricity recording to 24 hours. That was purely because we were very basic in our equipment. So this is a cardboard box with a sticker. Inside is the cheapest possible Android phone, where we stuck a current clamp into the microphone jack. We gave that to people. And the reason it was 24 hours, after 24 hours, the battery was dead. But with lots of bits of 24 hours of very high resolution electricity data, we had sort of one piece of the puzzle. Remember, this is long before smart meters. And the second thing we would do alongside this is we'd ask people to fill in diaries. And to begin with, this was literally paper diaries where they'd write down item by item what they did in the day, and then we'll compare the two. How does electricity use relate to the things people do? We tested, we expanded this, and we sort of built out the very same cheap Android phone that we gave to people in that cardboard box. We gave to them with an app preloaded where they could then report their activities a bit more easily. That then became a web interface, even easier still. The devices that Robin complained can only do 24 hours became consumer access devices. So we've developed this kit that we can now send to people that they plug into their broadband router with an Ethernet cable and a bit of power. It's pre-configured to connect to their smart meter, and data, you'll be pleased to hear, continuously flows into our database straight from their homes. So we've got much better data to see longitudinally what happens to electricity use. And then we just periodically ask them to give us additional insights to activities. And towards the end of the slides, I'm going to introduce you to the EDI, which is sort of the next generation coming our way. So the journey that we've been on with collecting these data sort of started, as I said, sort of slightly over 10 years ago. And in those days, things were easy because we had practically no data. So if you wanted to speculate over what happens in people's lives, energy use wise, you basically made it up by assuming what you think people might be doing. We're in the world of sort of agent-based models. You populate them until they do roughly what you observe in the real world, calibrate them, and you're happy to go. Then we come to a slightly more painful phase where you have some data, so you can ask some people what they tell you they do, and then you have a lot of filling in to do. So that's quite a bit of work. And now we're at the cusp of what one colloquially calls big data. And that's where the tools and the methods can change quite fundamentally. And I want to talk a little bit about how we change those tools. One thing I've noticed for the first time this summer, we had an MSc student who literally in previous years, I would spend a lot of time explaining data science and how to analyze large data sets. This year, for the first time, ChatGPT did my job for me. So the student essentially just asked, here's some data, here's some columns. How do I shape it into a graph that looks like that? And that worked. I mean, obviously, what sort of questions you ask, that's still down to us. But a lot of the heavy lifting is already being done by data and by sort of all the co-pilot tools that we can use at our disposal. So those three phases, and if I was very glibly characterizing them by the effort that we put into this was pretty straightforward and easy. That was jolly hard work. And this is my dreamy expectation that as the data gets bigger and bigger and our tools get better and better, we can start to sit back and do analysis in a far more convenient way. That's the hope. Now, I do want to talk to you about how this is essentially a revelation that came to me just in the last few days, and I'm so blown away. Weeks. I want to introduce you to a wonderful person. This is Judea Pearl, and he has done some fantastic work on Bayesian models and networks, and sort of one of those key figures in artificial intelligence and the sort of tools behind it. And one thing that I think sort of struck him quite strongly is if you rely entirely on statistics, and statistics is very much observational in its nature. So if you were to punch a statistician in the face, they would not be able to tell you whether their face hurt because you punched them or if you punched them because their face hurt. It's just correlation to a statistician. But of course, that's not really how we work. I mean, intuitively, we all very much have a very strong sense for what caused what. So the way the mind works is in a causal sort of way. And Judea Pearl's, I think, quite profound and important insight is if we want AI to work meaningfully with us, it should have that sort of cognitive capability of seeing causes and understanding causes. And the fact that statisticians and many people in the research community just don't even touch causality, concerned him a bit. And he worked on that. And he came up with a delightfully straightforward method to graph causal models that I just want to share with you because it's so wonderful and it sort of shapes how we want to go about understanding energy use, because there's so much questions of causation. If you insulate a home, does that cause the demand reduction? Or the whole rebound debates, what causes what? So causation in energy research is left, right, and center. So let me give you a nice causal model of my own. I've got this quirky sense that the sun rises because cockerels crow. Yeah, and I can show you loads and loads of data to back that up. In fact, the more data I collect, the harder it'll be for you to convince me that I'm onto something wrong here. Because the correlation is just really compelling. The more data you get, the more compelled you'll be. So the way Judea Pearl would depict this is a causal model. It's saying this arrow is telling you that the sun is listening to the cockerel. When it hears the cockerel, it rises. That is the causality. Cockerel causing the sun to rise. And the way he would suggest we should test this model is with this delightfully simple but wonderfully powerful operator called do. We need to do something to see if that model is actually true. So what this notation says is this is the probability of the sun rising given that the cockerel crowed. And now our challenge is to see if that probability is different from this one. The probability of the sun rising given that we made the cockerel not crow. So the way we do that is we tie up the beaks of all the cockerels and then observe whether the sun still rises or not. Chances are this model is flawed and the sun will still rise. I haven't done the experiment, but we have good causal understanding. So I'll just imagine that for the moment. So I then revise my model. A thinking person changes their mind. I now say, okay, maybe it's the other way around. Maybe the cockerel crows because the sun rises. And then the experiment looks slightly differently. So we've got the probability here. Probability of cockerel crowing given that the sun rises And then what we have to do is we need to stop the sun from rising. So let's put a padlock on the sun, stop it from moving. There might be another problem with my causal model of planetary movements, but humour me, that's the experiment. If we manage to stop the sun from rising and the cockerel stops growing, hey presto, that would support our causal model. But it actually gets better than this. And it gets better as a result of one of the problems that we have with a lot of these models, where we have sort of a cause and effect thing, and that is confounding variables. Total pain in the neck, they're everywhere and all the time, and how you deal with them is a real problem. So in this case, what we could say is, well, maybe it's not actually the cockerel that's listening to the sun at all. Maybe they're just, they both got wristwatches, and whenever it's 7 in the morning or whatever, the cockerel decides to crow because of the time, and the sun decides to rise because it's time to rise. And that's a problem, because then suddenly your model slightly falls apart. Incidentally, this is exactly what happened in the big sort of smoking cancer debate, where the question was, does smoking cause cancer? The tobacco industry cunningly said, well, no, really, what's going on is there's some smoking gene, and that happens to make you want to smoke, and it also causes you cancer. And suddenly they had a sort of get out of jail card to say, no, it's not really the smoking that causes cancer, it's that gene, blame the gene. Whether you can find it or not doesn't matter, we've got that as our excuse. So the way to get around that is you find something in between in the causal chain. So in this case, if we said, what if it isn't the sun that causes a cockerel to crow, but it's the shine of the light? And that we could sort of put in between and say, okay, well, we'll decouple the sun rising from the shine, and this we can now put in a box and say, okay, we have control over this. So our do operator suddenly becomes really practical and manageable. What we need to be super careful now is the do needs to be independent of everything outside this box. So you mustn't check the time when you toggle the light. You need to do that randomly. You also better don't do anything to do with the sun rising or not. If you do this properly randomly, and you find a relationship between the light shining and the cockerel crowing, then you've disarmed all those confounding variables. So you can now say, okay, if this leads to that, and we all agree that the sun shines, then we're done. The analogy with the smoking case was tar in the lung. So you could argue that smoking causes tar in the lung. Tar in the lung was correlated to cancer, and you can make a reasonable case, unless you're very, very embedded in the tobacco industry, that there is no gene that can cause you to have tar in your lungs, and you're done. It's beautiful, and I love it very much. That's why I wanted to share it, but I also want to show you how we might be able to apply this in some of the work that we're now able to do as part of this demand observatory and laboratory. So what we need is up to these 3 things. So we always need to have a causal model. We need to sort of put down what our belief system is, what causes what. We need some observations to see if they actually align with our model. And then sometimes, but not always, you need to do something. And by do, I mean something that is totally under our control rather than just observation. And because this is called the Energy Demand Observatory and Laboratory, you can see why I like this so much, because we'll do some observing, but we'll also do some doing. So let me give you a bunch of examples out of the world of energy. So one of the very common models that we have in energy is the EPC, the Energy Performance Certificate, which gives you a sense of how energy efficient your home is. Everyone has it, they're public. You can go online and look up anybody's address and see what their EPC rating is. And they go from A, which is the best, all the way down to F and G, which is terrible. Most people are sort of in this zone here. And the idea is that a building with a poor EPC rating will use more energy. And that's why you need to be warned about it. If you buy a house, they have to tell you what the rating is so that you can brace yourself for the bills that come your way. The quirk is what the model suggests and what we actually observe in real life. And this is data from the Smart Energy Research Lab. So they're basically the precursor to our energy demand observatory and laboratory. Thousands and thousands of homes with smart meter data. And if you then compare the ratings of the buildings to the actual observed hard data, you see there's a massive gap in between. And what causes that gap? That's sort of one of those questions that we try to understand. And in order to sort of give you a sense for how difficult it actually is to understand energy use in buildings, I've got a sort of, energy, a systems approach to it. So we've got the system, which in our case, we're sort of interested in homes and everything that goes into homes. And we've got inputs into these systems. That's all the different fuels. And that's the stuff that we're actually quite good at. You know, we can measure electricity going in. We could, in theory, measure gas. I'd love to measure how much wood goes in. We don't really have a handle on that, but you can see this is quite tangible stuff. You can measure that, quantify it, write it down. Then we want to understand what happens in the home, and that we'll do with sensors and surveys and various other things. We can then see, you know, what's going on, which things are on, what's the temperature, those sort of things. But then, and this is sort of what's one of the ambitions and innovations of EDOL, is we also want to know why. And these why questions, they're actually quite at home here in the School of Geography, of, you know, what actually happens with that energy? What do we use it for? What we usually refer to as an energy service. So nobody's interested in consuming kilowatt hours. They don't do anything for us. We want what they do for us. And that's things like information, motion, and heat. And some of that we turn into great use. You know, if you're using a screen, there's information delivered, but very often, you know, there's lights left on in rooms that are unoccupied that we classify as waste. Where we draw the line between useful energy and waste, Tina can tell you all about that, or at least can tell you how difficult it is to draw that line. And that's one of the things that we try to understand is, you know, how do we tell one from the other? Where does somebody's indulgence start and somebody else's waste? And it's touchy and sometimes contentious stuff, but we have the ambition to at least sort of explore that space. So practical example, very topical, heat pumps. And any of you who spend any time on Twitter will have read a lot of stuff about heat pumps, of how they don't work and can't work and shouldn't work. And one of the things that's often held against them is that when it's cold, they don't work. And anybody with a sound understanding of physics will say, yeah, that's sort of plausible. You know, the colder the air is, the harder it is to extract energy from it. But, you know, people get away with this sort of statement. But so far, there's actually been relatively little data to tell us how strong that effect is. Until, and this is the MSc student from our Energy Systems MSc who used ChatGPT to trawl through electrification of heat data and found some really interesting things in there, such as if you differentiate between some of the least efficient homes and the most efficient homes, the difference is a sort of peak demand. This is a period I'm especially interested in because that's sort of what could cause the system all sorts of issues. The electricity use of heat pumps at peak demand in the more efficient homes is around 54% lower. So the impact on the grid, on the coldest day this is, can actually be significantly reduced if you have well-insulated housing stock. So this goes right back to Christopher and Smith's analysis of, you know, there were cases where you had to store energy for 30 years because of a particularly cold and windless winter. This would save us a huge amount if we got that right. And that difference between a well-insulated and a poorly insulated home is dramatic. Having said that, the earlier statement was, oh, they don't work when it's cold. Well, even in the less well-insulated homes, the temperature is still kept at very comfortable levels. So they work either way, but key takeaway here already, you know, improving your housing stock, massive benefit for the system overall. Now, this is, as we discussed earlier, just observational data. So this is data that we had from the electrification of heat project that we can then analyze, but to really understand, you know, what are the causes that improve things. For that, you then want to have a model because it's possible that, you know, a lot of people who have heat pumps, they're rich anyway, they have well-insulated homes already. So that may not be your sort of, you know, randomized control group that you really want. So what we need to do is find people with heat pumps, but then also control by finding things in the middle that we can control and change. And again, a bit like before, we have to put that chicken in a box. So the chicken is my euphemism for the outcome that we want: a well-working heat pump system with great energy service delivered to customers. So you end up with this sort of chicken and egg problem here in the box, where we can identify specific things that we want to change, like insulation, like underfloor heating, like advice or control systems that help people use heat pumps in the right way, and then understand which of these things are really successful in a causal and quantified way. So that was one example. Of course, what's behind this is we don't just want to observe change. I think this is even the ECI motto, isn't it? So we want to understand change, but ultimately we want to make change happen. And that's where sort of the three levels of having access to data really become even more significant. So if you have to hypothesize what people might do if I raise the energy price, people might do this. Really hard to speculate. Or if they change tariff from one to another. So making this up is easy, but really fraught with difficulty. If you have a bit of data and you ask people what they think they might do if the price changed, or if you give them a different tariff, that's really hard on them. It's sometimes really hard to know in these hypothetical cases where you go. So where we try to take this with the EDOL program is get our hands on some data that actually shows us what happened when people experience these changes. Totally new opportunities that we've got there. So here's one of the classics. Any economist will tell you that this is a ground truth. Energy use listens to the price of energy. That's almost a non-debatable issue among economists, and at the macroeconomic level, absolutely undisputed. When the oil price goes up, people will cut back on energy use. That is established, and even though that's pure correlation, I have no reason to question the causation. But we're talking here about domestic household electricity use, and things there might be different. So the experiment, thinking back to Judea Pearl, is we need to do something about the price. Trouble is, every time I put in an ethics application to jack up everybody's electricity price, I get really hostile responses. So we can't do that. But guess what? Ofgem did it for me last year. Time and again, they upped the electricity price for everyone. I said, thank you. Because then we have data where we can compare what happens when people have their price raised. Sorry, I shouldn't have made fun of this. This is awful. For a lot of people, this was really, really difficult times. But for us, it was a good chance to sort of see what actually happens when prices go up. And first order, if you just compare, the dotted line is essentially just a repeat of the previous year. You see that, yes, demand has fallen. You need to sort of weather correct for that because the December was especially cold. That was a counteracting effect. But at this high level, the premise that price goes up, demand goes down stands. No question about it. The slight snag is this trend I could have shown you for the last 20 years solid. Demand has always fallen. Little known fact, but energy demand in the UK is falling year on year on year. It might turn around once we do more electrified heating and transport, but so far the trend is solidly down. So it's not necessarily a given that the demand reduction is actually caused by the price increase. But we can plot that. We can have a look at the numbers and put them on a sort of elasticity plot where we have the change in the price that the people pay. So this is more expensive, this is less expensive. So for most people, you'd expect they'd now be on the right side of this graph. And then in response, how much more or less energy have they used? They use more, they're up. They're using less, they're down. So a typical place where you'd expect people to be sort of along here, and a negative slope would tell you that there's negative price elasticity. Price goes up, demand goes down. That's how things should be. Now, if we populate this a little bit more, actually it looks like that. And that is what in statistics is called a mess or noise. And one thing any self-respecting data scientist should never do when they see noisy data is linear regression. Sod it. Let's just put a line through it anyway. So the economists in you will now think, it's negative slope, it's good, all is good. No, A, I shouldn't have done that because that's noise. There's no real regression here. And B, that is really a pathetic downward slope. So what you need to solidify your conviction that electricity use is negatively price elastic is chuck more data at it. Trouble is, when you do that, and be reminded, this line should not exist. I'll just put it there for your entertainment. Or because somebody might say, if I just put the dots on it, I could still imagine a negative line through that. It's not. And that line is just noise. Yeah. So there's far more noise than negative price elasticity signal in there to prove that electricity use is negatively price elastic. Loads and loads of point comparing, loads and loads of different tariffs for the same household before now. Having said that, if you then break the same data down by income groups, from the most affluent, the blue line, and then every time you up the income categories to the least affluent, the black line, the slope actually tips upwards. So in simple terms, what that means is the more affluent people are perfectly able to cut back on their energy use. The least affluent not only can't cut back, in fact, their energy use goes up, which is totally counterintuitive. So given that we're talking in causal model sort of language, I want to try to translate that into a causal model for you. And you immediately see why my chicken and eggs models were delightfully simple. In practice, these things are far messier. So here's our nice model. Energy use listens to price. But actually, energy use listens to lots of other things too. So, I mean, an obvious one is it depends on how many appliances you're using, how much you're using your appliances. That might depend on your energy needs. Your energy needs, and this is the line where I'll probably get into serious trouble in this department, social norms. Don't ask me how I measure them, but they exist, and they are things that affect our energy needs. So think, 100 years ago, people would never have dreamt to have a shower every day. Now that's totally the norm. They would never have washed a shirt after one usage. Now that's totally the norm. So there are things, social norms, that cause, and I say this word provocatively and deliberately, cause us to have certain energy needs. And another obvious one, and maybe slightly more easy to get our head around, is occupancy. So when people are not at home, they don't use as much energy. Stands to reason. Now, what of course happens here as well is when the energy price goes up, our energy use and energy price, if you multiply them, they'll affect your disposable income. And depending on how much disposable income you have, you may change your occupancy. So if you have a little spare cash, you won't be going out as much. So, and this is a causal model theory, out to be tested. Some of the least affluent homes may be in a situation where they may have treated themselves to the occasional going out event, which they now can't afford anymore. So they spend more time at home, end up using more energy. So energy price going up causes more demand. And in economics terms, people talk about a Giffen good, which is a sort of good where the price goes up, demand goes up. So classic example is people who can afford mostly bread and eat mostly bread, and sometimes they treat themselves to fruit or vegetables. But when the price of bread goes up, they'll have those treats less often, end up eating more bread. That's a theory. And obviously, if you want to test something like this, you need to have sort of some handle on measuring all these additional things. So occupancy in this case would have been really interesting to have. And good news, the EDOL program will try to capture those sort of bits of data going forward. Another example, and this is one that I've spent a lot of time, as Robin knows, I've tried to understand how flexible is demand, not just to price, which you've already seen, is sort of a difficult one, but just if you ask people to reduce demand at critical times. That was laughed at a few years ago, and last winter, as you may recall, National Grid asked people specifically almost exactly the question that I asked people for years. I think they just asked for 1 hour, I'm asking for 2. But the principle is the same, and it's very reassuring and comforting to see that the results that they're getting are actually quite similar. So that's nice. So in causal language, what we're trying to do is we observe energy use in response to life, universe and everything, so people go on about their lives as normal. And then we compare that with us, in addition, asking a question like this. Well, two questions. One is to reduce demand, the other one is to keep a diary so that we get a handle on what's actually going on. And what you get is lots of really interesting data. So one of the challenges here is, what do you compare to? So if you ask people to reduce demand and give them an incentive, so for national grid, people get paid if they reduce demand by a certain amount. Now, what is that compared to? And can people game it? You know, if you say, okay, I compare one day with another, well, on the first day, you might just jack up everything in order to then have a easier baseline to compare yourself with. And we try different things. So it needs to be obviously fair and within reason. So for them, we often used a Thursday for the intervention and then compare with the previous 4 Thursdays, which they couldn't have gamed because we only asked them a few days in advance. So the comparison line, which is the pink one here, pink to purple, they achieved demand reductions on the order of 36%, which is a lot more than I expected. But what was even more surprising is how they went about that. And the first thing I should say is, I mean, we've got hundreds of activity types that they can report, and a lot of them are bizarrely unaffected. So most aspects of daily life continues not too disturbed by this intervention. But one that really stands out and has done throughout is one that I was least willing to accept people would do. I mean, again, you know, if we try to speculate what people might do, my expectation was there's absolutely no way on earth that people would give up a hot evening meal, especially in Britain. You know, in Germany, totally, they have hot lunches and cold dinners, but in Britain, I thought a hot evening meal is a core part of the culture. But you know, it's one of the strongest differences that we found in the activity data, that people literally give up on a hot evening meal, or maybe if they can afford it, probably go out instead. So that was quite a striking finding. The other thing I should stress, I'm not tall enough to actually point out, but the gaming is quite limited. So people who didn't take part in the study at all still had a very similar profile to the control days that we used for the people who were in the study. The other thing that is almost stands to reason, but I think I'll just point it out again, is that in order to reduce your demand at peak times by a lot, it helps if you use a lot of energy. So people who used less energy anyway don't have as much to give. Those who use a lot, they also have more flexibility. And that sort of raises some equity questions. You know, should people who are frugal all the time be penalized by not being able to scoop rewards for studies like this? I've put this past the ethics board, but I've took the view that people who have really low demand, I gave them their reward anyway. You know, there were little rewards for taking part and successfully reducing demand. If you're among the lowest users, and they were so keen, you know, they'd even contact you. What else can I do? I thought, no, there's nothing else you can do. Have a reward. But you know, I can do that. That won't work as a national policy for demand response trials. I'm using my freedom. Those things. So yeah, that's. And again, you can see there's real challenges of, you know, what do we compare? What are the interventions? So we have another sort of chicken and eggs thing where we might want to try different approaches. So I've asked the simple question, could you use less? But it might also be, and increasingly interesting, if people have home battery storage, for example, raises all sorts of issues because, yes, they might go and turn the battery on and off, but that might also be delegated to, say, an AI system that's really clever at playing the markets, or some third-party service that provides it. So you know, who's actually controlling this will be an important question for us to understand when we try to create the counterfactual of, you know, which measure was effective. So we need to sort of test different forms of agency of who controls the demand response. At the moment, we're working on a simple model that I ask people and they do something, like give up a meal. But in the future, there'll be clever things going on with automated controls and other smart things, and understanding, you know, how the presence of those affects our baseline. Because it would be terrible if we judge these demand response systems against a counterfactual that already does clever things that we just don't know about. So we need to know. We need to observe that. So there's a lot we need to capture. But reassuringly, this is sort of one of my idols, the Tufty. He tells us that understanding human behavior isn't rocket science. It's harder. And I think he's absolutely right. You know, rocket science, no offense to any rocket scientists in the room, but rockets are somewhat reliable. You know, you can test them over and over again. If something breaks, you find out what it was and launch the next one until it works. With people, we can't quite do that. We can't experiment with people in the same way that we can with rockets. So it actually needs more and subtler ways to getting at the nub of the information that we're after. And that's one of the reasons why this energy demand observatory and laboratory that we're setting up now is such a vital component. You know, you need a lot more information to get a handle of something as complex and bewilderingly difficult to understand as humans. Now, one last thing I want to touch on, and that is the whole privacy angle. You know, what we're asking here are very sometimes personal, sensitive, identifying bits of information. This is the current consent form that people have to agree to when they're taking part in our study as it is. I would challenge anyone to answer me any questions about what it says in this form after they've signed for it. I had one participant who plugged our little consumer access device into their router and then asked me if I was now able to see her bank details and emails and so on. And initially I laughed that off. I thought, of course I can't. But I thought, well, if I wanted to spy on somebody, asking them to hardwire something into their router is probably a pretty good starting point. And hand on heart, I haven't taken apart the circuitry inside our consumer access device to see if there's anything that spies on them. So there are really, really deep fundamental ethical questions here. And at the moment, we're basically using a degree of trust. They trust us without reading this stuff top to bottom, and we try to be trustworthy that they do that correctly. So what is it we need to be concerned about here privacy-wise, and why is it important to be careful? Energy use itself, if you know, we already mentioned energy performance certificates, they're public good. I can look up anybody's address and see what their energy performance certificate is. So there seems to be a degree of openness. And in many countries, you'll see that the electricity meter is on public display. You know, you can walk past houses and the meter there. So the energy use itself doesn't seem to be intrinsically problematically private, shall we say. There's questions about occupancy. So a common complaint is that, oh, if I had somebody smart meter data, I can see when they're not at home and then burgle them. That's a very sophisticated burglar. And you know, you can get the same information by just waiting outside their home and see when the lights go out and when people leave the building. So again, obviously to be taken seriously, but probably not the sort of crux of smart meter data. Then there's privacy. You know, there's this the spying spouses example from the Netherlands, where partner suddenly discovered that their partner was having an affair because there was electricity use at times when you wouldn't expect it. Those sort of things. Of course, that is within the home. So you know, they both had totally legitimate access to their smart meter data. So we won't be able to do anything about that. Then there is sort of practices, stuff you wouldn't even expect you give away if you share your smart meter data. So one of my favorite examples is that you're perfectly happy to tell people how much energy you use, but you'd rather not know what religious practices you perform. If you're an observing Muslim, for example, Ramadan will stand out like a sore thumb from your low profile. It'll be very obvious if you're somebody who observes Ramadan. It'll be just as obvious if you observe it poorly. You know, all sorts of issues coming up from that. So there's a lot in load profiles that you can infer that we don't even think about yet, and very hard to have sort of informed consent on what's in. But the one that I want to just spend a couple of minutes on is identity, the ability to identify somebody through their load profile. So how unique is a profile, and can it be used to pinpoint you, and why could that be a problem? So, oops, going the wrong way here. Where am I? There. So how much smart meter data would it take to uniquely identify something? So if you gave me a few days of your data, does that already reveal who you are? So I've done this as a little sort of Monte Carlo experiment, just digging into our data, picking certain times of day, and then even rounding the electricity used to 50 watts, just to sort of randomize it a little bit. Because of course, if I had it to a milliwatt, then it might very quickly be unique to you. But if we do that, pick one value from your data and then see how many other people have the same value, and then step that out until it's unique to you. So I've done that with an example of 13,000 people for a month. And I was expecting, a few days will be fine. The fool I was. After only, so are we? Big reveal, there we are. On average, it only takes 5 half-hour readings. Those 5 readings are unique to you. That surprised me when I saw it, but it shouldn't have, because your social security number is only a few digits, and electricity readings can be anything from 0 to thousands of watts. So even me rounding it to 50 watts doesn't reduce it down very much. So only 5 readings. By the way, the way to stay undetectable is not use any energy at all. That'll be one way to stay anonymous. Why does this matter? So, we're talking about informed consent, and you might give informed consent to a data collector who says, look, we'll totally anonymize your data. All your name and address will be removed, but we'll just ask you for some health records of yourselves, and then maybe you can give us 1 day worth of smart meter data. Totally benign. I think nobody would have an else with that. You might also work with people like ourselves that collect continuous smart meter data, and nothing else personal. Again, totally anonymized, no trouble. This sort of, we often talk about, oh yeah, your data will be anonymized, don't you worry. So that's the situation here. And now let's introduce a really smart insurance company. And all they do is they ask you for, let's say, our 5 half-hour readings. And now they talk to data collector 1 and 2 and say, oh yeah, can we please share the data? And by the way, somewhere in your terms and conditions, it would have said, yeah, we're allowed to share your data with somebody else. What they can now do is they take that trace, find this little signature in here, that little signature in there, and hey presto, they can use this data here to connect your little bit of snippet to your health data. And they put it together. So this linking of data can be incredibly powerful, and that's where leaving something that's identifiable to you becomes problematic. So, the fingerprint analogy, you don't mind putting your fingerprint. I mean, your fingerprints will be all over the building and anywhere. It only becomes problematic if it's a crime scene, and suddenly, the linkage between these things matters. So there's a problem, and on the one side, we're really interested in detailed data. On the other hand, we don't want these sort of things to hold us back and get us into trouble. So there's currently 3 approaches to deal with that. One is to just aggregate. There's a rule that we're currently working towards, which is if you aggregate 10 households together, then the data is no longer personal. Sort of all gets blurred up and it's all right. Normally it's just 3. Because if it's 3, even if you're one of them, there's still 2 aggregated. If it was only 2 and you're 1, you subtract it and you know who the other one is. So 3 is a normal rule of thumb. 10 is a little bit arbitrary, just sort of extra safety, but nobody quite knows why. The next thing you could do that might be a little bit better is we don't just aggregate randomly, but we cluster very specifically. So for example, if we're interested in heat pump usage, we could put people with a heat pump together, and then you still have something that is of research interest maintained. But that still mangles a lot of stuff together. So the big ambition here is to synthesize data. So we've got so much smart meter data now and so many explanatory variables. If we can train a model to produce synthetic data, then we can actually generate our own. That A is no longer identifying anybody personal, it's nobody's actual data, but it also gives us new degrees of freedom where we can actually synthetically create load profiles for future scenarios of archetypes that don't yet exist, like people with heat pumps, electric vehicles, and other new things that we can sort of train the models onto. That'll be crucially important for us to be able to share data more willingly. At the moment, it is an absolute it's a polite word to say, it's hard work to get hold of smart meter data. There's a lot of data sharing agreements and processes that you need to subject yourself to. So if we can crack this, there'll be a lot of happy research communities. and a lot of benefit to be had, because basically more people being able to work with data means we learn more from it. So if you're interested in this, there's a fully funded DPhil in energy data privacy, which is principally to find out what do we need to guard about these data, what are the bits that are sensitive to participants, and then what can we do essentially to mash it up in such a way that it can be shared without divulging anything personal. If you're interested, get in touch with me directly or check the EDOL website. There's more information there. So I've talked an awful lot about EDOL without actually telling you exactly what EDOL is. So I thought I'll just close by giving you a few pointers of what EDOL is all about. It's an EPSRC funded program between the School of Geography here, Engineering Science Department, which is where I am now, and UCL. UCL have a fantastic track record of collecting large-scale smart meter data, and now what we want to do is sort of put that on a new footing of detail, and also make sure it becomes longitudinal. So the really key thing about EDOL is, Robin's critique of meters collecting 24 hours. What we're really interested in is to see the long-term trends. Yeah. So between now and us reaching net zero, how does the energy transition happen? What measures are effective? If we insulate homes, how much do you really get out of that? Which things should we accelerate? Where do we need to stop trends that are unwanted and undesirable? And we'll do this in ways that should be unintrusive and really low cost, so we can scale it up. But in order to make it unintrusive and low cost, we'll do some things that are very intrusive and expensive. So we'll oversample homes, really understand, what are the things we need to know, what can we infer through other bits of information. So there'll be a lot of that going on in the first rounds, and then we build into that delightful light touch version of painless observation. So EDOL will deliver socio-technical research. It'll be responsive to fast-moving technological and policy changes. So we've seen, every year the pressures change. So we want to be that sort of stable data backbone that can respond to the pressures that come and go. We're very keen to make these data available to scientists. So if you're interested to work with this sort of data, again, please get in touch. We want to make it useful. And we'll use data-driven approaches. So basically, we want to learn from the data how to collect data in a reliable and low-cost way. We do that with funky, new, innovative approaches. And this takes me, and I've got two of my own. So by spending a lot of money up front, I hope that we can really get the running cost of this thing down. So in 5 years' time, when this program finishes, I want it to be a no-brainer for the Research Council to say, yes, we've got to continue this because we've invested this money in order to make it now really cheap going forward. So by inventing and investing in the right infrastructure, I hope that the marginal cost, as the economists like to call it, becomes really, really low. And my other big ambition is share the data, let you all have easy access to the data and work with it. So it consists of two main parts: the observatory, which is where we try not to interfere with people. So we'll ask them surveys, and there'll be some instrumentation in their home, but it should all be nice and light touch. And then alongside that, we've got laboratories, and that's essentially where the chicken and the eggs is. That's where we try stuff out, where we sample particular subgroups of the population and experiment. But then importantly, we have this as our control group that we can compare with. That's the important thing here. The other sweet little thing we've got up our sleeve is that there will be times when our models don't agree with what we find, where the arrows don't point in the right direction, and we just can't make any sense of it. And this is where we have the opportunity to go in and really sort of investigate on the ground. We call this forensics, and strictly speaking, EDOL should have been called EDOLF because it's also forensics, but that sounded too much like a sort of 21st century Nazi, so the F is silent. But this basically allows us to go into homes, talk to people, have a look around what's actually going on, and in our experience, you learn invaluable things that you'll never get from data. You really have to go down and sort of engage in a far more direct way. And by doing that, the idea is that we gain new insights into what other sensors we might want to install or what other things we might need to sort of inquire about. And by trialing and experimenting with those, they then eventually end up hopefully in the observatory to give us a more complete picture of what's going on. In the interest of time, because I think with this already gone on, there's a few examples of things that we do and don't want to do. So we don't want to observe people sitting in the bath, but we might be able to infer that by looking at hot water usage and things like that. We definitely don't want to put any cameras or microphones in people's faces on a sort of regular basis. This is to be avoided. So if at all possible, we try to detect and infer things as subtly as at all possible. And one of the sort of dream devices that we're currently sort of exploring of developing would be just one little plug that you put into your socket. It automatically connects to your smart meter to collect smart meter data. It measures temperature, it measures occupancy. So very promising approach to detect occupancy without even spying on people is just to pick up how many mobile phone signals are in the vicinity. That could be very neat. And it then also acts as a little hub. So if we need additional sensors, for example, you want temperature in other rooms, it could act as the sort of comms hub inside a home. So if you're a NEDO participant, there is no engineer that has to come into your home and drill holes and lay cables. It should ideally be as simple as putting in a plug like this and the data flows and you're fine. And then if you want to know more about energy use, you can follow the ID that's printed on there and then see what your usage is and give us additional survey information if you so choose. Here's an example of the sort of data sharing. I know Paul already played with this. So you can, for example, see, I think, were you a dog or a cat person? Cats. You've got a cat. You're one of the good ones. So cats are not as bad. Dogs are really bad. If you click dog, it means your demand is 10.2% higher. And I mean, again, sort of going back to causal models, we don't yet know whether you can blame the dog for that. To find out whether the dogs are to blame, we need to shoot half the dogs and then measure the difference. But there's other things. So people with dogs tend to have bigger homes, or having a bigger home makes you more likely to have a dog. So that won't change if we shoot the dog. But there might be other things that if you have a dog, you keep the windows open more for ventilation, or you may heat your home more. So all those sort of things. But yeah, we need to find some alternative way to come up with causal things that don't kill cats or dogs. But yeah, there's lots of things we can explore and then sort of build into our models. And that's pretty much all I wanted to say. Just to say thank you very much, and thank you to these people. Tina is actually in the room. She asked me not to bounce all questions to her, but she essentially leads the social science part, which is, as you can imagine, a huge part of this program. And then Zainab, Marina, Christian does transport, which I haven't really talked all that much about, so maybe we can get him to talk about the transport part someday. And Charlie Wilson gets a special mention because he was instrumental in creating this whole proposal, and very sadly isn't actually, he's our wise counsel now, so we're very grateful to have him in that capacity. Right, I'll finish there. Thank you very much.
Do you feel opportunity available at time of recording only? Right. Can I just chair's prerogative? You did early on show some average numbers, which was energy use in different energy performance certificate properties, but we know there's a 10 or 21 to 1 ratio between the highest and lowest energy use.
Yeah.
Are you going to be able to unpick what's happening? This decoupling between what an energy performance certificate on average tells us and why there's such a huge variation in actual demand, because this is an example of why an average doesn't help you with any individual house. Yeah.
In fact, I mean, this was something I was asked early on. Oh, why don't I just find a handful of the most typical homes of the UK and then analyze them really carefully? And for exactly that reason, it just doesn't work. There is no person who is 52% Brexit and 48% Remain. There's a broad spread of people that.
If you like, one of the reasons I ask is I worked in the lighting industry for a while, and the models of lighting use were built on a survey of houses. In 1997, 25 houses were measured in Gloucestershire, and the whole model was built on top of that, including tweaks for, if we move from incandescent to other lamps, there'll be less heat dissipation in the kitchen. I mean, that's such an infinitesimal thing. But again, a 10 or 20 to 1 ratio, there must be some better metrics we can put on that.
Yeah, and I mean, Elexon believes that there's only 2 types of people, those with the electric heating and those without. So yeah, in practice, we know there's hundreds and thousands of different archetypes of energy use. And yeah, with more data, we can unpack them more, and we can also then have far better targeted policies to suit people's context.
And that's my second chair's prerogative question. Most studies I've looked at, we didn't look at profile 2, in other words, electrically heated customers. It was too difficult. So there's a whole class of electrical heating where we have quite a lot of data, but people have not been using or analysing it. Tenements in Scotland, for example.
Yeah.
So are you going to be able to bring in data sets from resistive heating at conventionally heated properties?
Yeah, I mean, in fact, that is sort of one of the helpful things. So what gets more difficult, or one of the concerns as we electrify everything, in the past, you could tell heating apart from all other appliances because heating was gas and all other appliances were electricity. Now that heating becomes electric, vehicles become electric, it all becomes sort of one big electric blurb. So being able to unpack or disaggregate, as we like to say, the heating part from other electrical usage is a key problem for us. And this is sort of where we can now train our data on exactly people who are electrically resistive heating, electric night storage heaters. And one thing, I mentioned longitudinal. So as people transition from one heating system to another, it's wonderful for us. So say you're on gas, we have gas and electricity data for you, and then you install a heat pump, and your gas disappears and the electricity goes up. We can use that to compare how well is your heat pump performing compared to your previous gas usage, and learn when heat pump systems perform as expected or less.
So I've asked the rubbish questions. Does that mean someone's come up with a better one while I've been padding for time?
I have a couple of questions. So one of them is very short. When you said people gave up their evening meals, do you think maybe they replaced that? Because I did a study with qualitative data, and what they did is they cooked earlier in the day and they just heated it in the microwave during the demand reduction sessions that National Grid had. So I don't know if you can test that with your.
Yeah, so and this is why we've got a lot of categories. So one thing that we've noticed is a substitution. In fact, I've got a paper on 8 different ways to shift your load. So yeah, you can move forward, backwards, substitute, do something totally different. So yeah, it's definitely so the number of snacks went up, for example. The other fun substitution we found was that people tend to have more cups of tea when we ask them to reduce demand, which seems counterintuitive because making a cup of tea uses energy, but somehow seems to be a coping mechanism and it more than offsets all the things that they then didn't do. Yeah, snacks went up. What we haven't seen so much, and again, that was sort of my expectation, is that we sort of a preloading. We have seen more sort of moving backwards, and this might be very specifically to the 5 to 7. Sometimes people then just move it to after 7. Bearing in mind that one of the troubles with meal preparation, and I said meal preparation rather than the meal itself, it's sort of front loaded. If you have a meal, the preparation sort of happens beforehand. So there's a bit of an offset.
My other question was around this 5 half-hourly data point. So how does that actually work? Because I can't figure that out. Like, you could maybe tell my signature because I live on my own. But if there's a shared home or a family, how can you tell each person's individual energy signature from just 5 data points?
So what I can do is, if you give me 5 readings from your electricity meter, and that'll be 500 watts, 1000 watts, 880 watts, there will be nobody else in that cohort that we looked at that has exactly the same pattern.
Do I use that, like, do I need to use it like that every day, or how, or on a particular day?
Oh,
like
this is
pattern?
Yeah, no, this is on any day. So I randomly pick Tuesday at 3 in the afternoon. Anka is using 550 watts. How many other people are using exactly that amount at any point in the month? So, I mean, think of. I gave the example of the social security number. If you have several digits that can be letters or numbers, every electricity reading of yours is like a number or digit. It could be from 0.50 up to 2000 or something. So you only need a very few number of digits until you've got a unique number combination for yourself. Does that make sense?
That's great. So you kind of pick that up and you've identified me. Okay, and that's how the data gets collected.
Yeah, it couldn't be anybody else. If I know these numbers are yours, there's nobody else who has the same combination of numbers and letters.
But it just feels static, like, because then I've changed my behavior. So you've
Yeah.
identified me once, but then in a year, it's a different signature. So
Yeah.
the data is not that relevant long term.
If we're talking about 20 years worth of data and I wanted to identify you exactly, there's a greater chance that somebody else will have followed exactly the same pattern over 5.5 hours. So yeah, for clarity, the experiment I did was 1 month's worth of data for 13,000 people.
Yeah, well, it wasn't my question, but it raises another question for me, playing, I guess, devil's advocate a bit, I guess. But assuming that you're still that third, insurance agency or whatever, how many intervals of data already would it be for a tech company to find the same amount of information and buy their services? Like when we're talking about comparative of this to other things that I've already given my data away to everyone on the internet.
The irony is this is happening every day, everywhere to all of us. The reason I guess we ought to be concerned about that, but we're not. The reason we're concerned about it here is that the rollout of smart meters is a government program. The government is very, very concerned that if you get a bad press about smart meters, people don't want them anymore. Whether shoving people prepaid meters in their home under duress helps the case, I don't know, but
that has nothing to do with smart metering. Smart metering is actually totally prepaid customers.
Sorry, I'll take that back. The government is very concerned about a data leak giving smart meters bad press. And I agree, you don't want a data leak, so I'm perfectly happy to do this in an ethically sound way. That we're giving away data frivolously and dangerously in other contexts is out of scope.
We can say we do it in double the amount of time as, the amount that we already give away for the tech companies.
Yeah.
We keep your data longer. No.
Yeah, I mean, that's...
Should we draw a parallel more with the decadal survey? If you go out and take the census of the country, that collects a lot of personal information.
Yeah.
And it's guaranteed it won't go below 5 households as the kind of the minimum level at which you can access the data.
Yeah.
And some people are concerned why you're monitoring at this level of scrutiny about religion or other practices. And that again is a national program.
Yeah.
But there's a statistical office that is looking after that data, which apparently is trusted.
Yeah. And I mean, if you want to do this PhD, one of the early questions I would ask you is, what is it that actually needs to be protected? What is it that people don't want revealed about themselves? Clearly, for Facebook to scrape their data seems to be perfectly okay, rightly or wrongly. So as a slight analogy, we looked at locational data that's being collected by smartphones. And the survey that people had to do for that asked them, first question of the survey was, are you concerned about your location data being collected through your phone? Then all sorts of survey questions that slightly hinted at what sort of things you can do with location data. And the last question of the survey was just a repeat. Are you happy for your location data to be collected through your mobile phone? The approval rate just collapsed in the course of that survey because people just never thought about what giving your location data away actually means. People can infer how often you go to the gym or whether you have a healthy or unhealthy lifestyle. So again, we don't actually know if people have, I say people give me informed consent. I very much question that they really know what they're consenting to, and I'd love it if they could be informed in giving their consent.
Well, thank you very much for the talk. Can I ask how households are recruited to the laboratory, and if there are any confounding factors about households that are willing to let you intervene in response to that?
Yeah, key question, and sort of one of the really, really big challenges that we have. So for the laboratory, we don't necessarily always have the expectation that it has to be totally representative. So in some cases, we deliberately pick people who have a heat pump or who have smart technologies because we want to understand that. But the observatory, it very much is the ambition to be representative and unbiased. And again, you've got the usual problems. All my samples are people who are willing to take part. The people who don't want to take part don't. So anybody with serious data privacy issues doesn't agree. How you correct for that is the eternal problem of sampling. We hope that by sort of comparing with other national statistics, we can get a feel that what we have is representative. The other skew that we have sort of built into the whole thing is the population of people with a smart meter is not representative of the general population. So if you live in a privately rented flat, you're far less likely to benefit from these things.
That should change now because the smart meter.
Yeah, should have changed in 2020 when everybody had a smart meter.
I agree, but I think now because it's coming close to 60%,
Yeah.
so it should gradually become
Yeah.
100%.
No, absolutely. I mean, when I first started, the share of smart meters was so pitiful, we couldn't have relied on it. Now that we're beyond 50%, it becomes usable.
Bill, I think got 3 questions, 4
Lovely.
questions waiting. Yay.
So it's pretty significant to factor in the long-term phenomena into the short-term consumption patterns. For example, looking at the hourly data consumption, weather is important, right?
Yeah.
But looking at the changing climate and let's say floods, wildfires, or climatic events like that, do you think that's important to factor in while understanding these consumption patterns?
Yeah, what do you mean by factor it in?
Okay, for example, so I did some research in my previous master's on energy demand forecasting in Pakistan.
Yeah.
And I was working on the short-term load forecasting. And of course, I factored in the weather, the temperature, and different sorts of variables associated with temperature. But then I saw some anomaly when in the output, and when I traced it back, there was a huge flood in Pakistan where it really affected the demand of that region.
Yeah.
And that was like very much observable into the demand pattern in that window.
Yeah.
So do you think it's important to factor in such events when understanding the demand of the consumer?
Yeah, I mean, so events happen, and very often, so if you do small scale studies, you're very likely to miss them. We're hoping that just through scale and longevity, we can pick up things that we didn't write in the proposal as something we want to observe, but will happen. Like we didn't anticipate COVID, we didn't anticipate the energy price crisis, and we don't anticipate the next catastrophe that might be around the corner. So I hope that by having an observatory in place that doesn't just look at the energy, which of course you already found is affected, but if we then also see additional data that helps us explain what was going on, did people take the case of a flood, do they then sort of move to other people's properties and the load shifted, or do they move to the upstairs and live very differently? And sort of related, really pertinent questions to us is, if you have a power cut, how do people respond to that? There might be all sorts that we can learn. The bummer about power cuts is that all our sensing solutions probably cut out as well. So it's a conundrum. Thanks.
I just it was like the graph that was on how much demand reduction potential. And I just wanted to ask like, well, what are the reasons that did you focus on demand side solutions? And also like having
Yeah, so the 3 big audiences are other academics, industry to see what solutions work. So if you keep going on about heat pumps, so there's a topical example. If you're rolling out heat pump, what actually happens to those properties energy-wise, and are there models or installation processes that work better than others? You can sort of help them focus on what works. And then, the last one, policy is an absolutely major motivation for this. In fact, the Department, DESNES, the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, is a sort of partner stroke champion of this, because they famously for the last 10 years have rolled out one demand side policy after another that abysmally failed because they weren't able to test it. So with these laboratories, the idea is if you have a clever idea for a policy, you could try it out, test it, see what happens, how people respond, and not just sort of the immediate response, which is what we're often limited to with short studies. But say home insulation might work brilliantly for the first year. So we have famous examples where you do cavity wall insulation and the cavity wall insulation falls down after a year and you're back to where you were. You want to know those sort of things through observation, which takes sometimes years to observe. And that's why government is very interested in having sort of longitudinal observation of these trends. Yeah, so I mean, I'll definitely make the case to government that if they want to test policies, what we want to know is, does this policy cause a beneficial effect? Or, which is just as likely, if you try something out while everybody's reducing demand, the demand reduction that you see is what's to be expected anyway, at which point you don't need to bother. So yeah, I'm very gung-ho about the causality being my view. I mean, last time I talked about causal models, I had a social scientist speaking after me and said, as a social scientist, I don't believe in causality, or it's not an issue for me. It's not how I see the world. So I'm very aware that I've got a slightly engineering-y approach to this.
So Phil, we've probably got time for a couple of quick questions before we wrap up for people online. Yeah. So I don't know if you can pick up.
Yeah, I think you both have your.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about in the study that you did, where you said you initially thought that people would kill like the condition without on the survey radar. Did you study people's perceptions of difficulty or like people's perceived sticky areas when it comes to societal change? Because I think that would be a really interesting data set that would like on that. Or like, we were mentioning that demand capital has been consistently dropping, but the remainder to get to net zero is going to potentially shifts. Yeah. Did you study people's perception of those things?
So funnily enough, I do, and this is by a real quirk of coincidence. So when I set up this whole diary process, there's something called the UK Time Use Survey, which is paper diaries. And in the year that I devised all this, they added a column to their surveys, which was labeled enjoyment. So for each activity, you could think whether you enjoyed it very little or not at all, or very much. And they reported back that every time they added extra questions to their surveys, they had higher dropout rates. This was the first time in their history and experience that they added a question where the retention rate was higher. So asking people if they enjoy something seemed to make them enjoy the process more. I thought that's enough reason for me to include it. But it then helped us answer exactly your sort of question. If we put people under the strain of reducing their demand, does that mean their enjoyment levels go down? And we haven't found that trend at all. I mean, I would say I'm fishing in slightly thin data, but if anything, there were sort of tendencies where people almost enjoyed the process. One of the substitutions that we saw was that they had more cups of tea, and having a cup of tea was one of the most enjoyable activities. So it slightly skews the picture. But yeah, I totally get what you're getting at. Is if you ask people to be flexible, you're inconveniencing them. And surely that has a price that isn't necessarily expressed in money, but something just, this is annoying. I want to have a hot meal. So to be continued, we keep asking that question about enjoyment.
Going back to demand not necessarily increasing when the price increases, do you have any data sets that include on-peak and off-peak pricing and how that might affect the income brackets? Because obviously I think a lot of us were surprised to see that the lower income energy use actually went up. And if you have higher disposable income, you might not care if it's on peak or off peak because you can pay for it anyway. And is there any detrimental aspect to a low income household that has to change their way of life to only pay during the low peak periods?
Yeah, So the first part, time of use tariffs, yes, there are studies. The trouble is, of course, time of use tariffs is, it's not a, in Judy Appel's language, not a do operation. People choose to have these tariffs, and because they choose them, so that's the reason you choose a tariff that penalizes peak time usage because you know you can deal with that. You know, maybe because you have flexibility, you've got the to maneuver that. So what you can't do is force people with a do operator onto different time use tariffs and then see how they react. And then the other question about the price response as a function of income. There was one category of income that I've actually conflated into the top category. It's the very highest income users are law unto themselves. They just don't care. You know, whatever you plot, the very highest incomes don't adhere to the same rules.
Do you think that in the future, time use tariffs will become required? Because I'm from California and time use rates are flat with no choice. For 9 p.m., it's 37 cents a kilowatt hour, and then solar times and night times it's as low as 5 to 7 cents an hour, and you don't have a choice.
Yeah, and that's the very point. You don't have a choice. In Britain, we have somehow chosen to give everyone a choice, and I didn't bang on about it, but one of the things that was interesting about the off-term price cap changes, the government's price guarantee over the last year was choice was certainly not there anymore. You know, before people just said, "Oh, if you don't like your electricity price, shop around for something cheaper." That was completely gone. So again, from my experiment, that was helpful because we're all on an equal footing. The other thing that we found, quite interestingly, my wife jumped at that straight away. The more children you have, the higher the tariff that you pay. And my wife's immediate interpretation of that was, you just haven't got time to shop around for the cheapest tariff because you've got too many other things going on. But this idea that we will constantly sort of track the prices and find the cheapest one. The only reason we had to introduce the energy price cap was because evidence showed people don't. They gradually get moved on to more and more expensive tariffs. So I have some sympathy for just saying that here's the standard tariff. But sorry, this is still on video. I didn't say that.
Nick, you've been waiting patiently. All right. Can I just say again, thanks very much to Phil. That was Phil. Just put in an advert, maybe we should make great programming be broadcast only on linear TV at certain times of the day and see if that attracts people away from peak periods, but that's just a pet subject. Next week we have Sugandha Shrestha, sorry, I knew I'd messed that up, talking about the acceleration of new innovations. I think it'd be very exciting, and look forward to seeing as many there as possible. Thanks very much for people joining online as well. Thank you.
Thank you.